Welcome back to the Bitcoin Layer. I'm Joe Consorti. Today, joined with us once again is Matthew Pines, the Director of Intelligence at Sentinel One and the National Security Fellow over at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. Matt, what's going on, man?
Just chilling. Looking forward to our chat.
Absolutely. Well, you do a lot. You know you do a lot. I mean, you're all over the place, and so this talk is going to be very multifaceted. The viewers are going to love it. We're going to talk about strategic Bitcoin reserve, mechanics behind that, geopolitical flashpoint, AI, tech advancements, UFOs. So we'll cover all of it. But first things first, let's dive into your tweet. So you put out a tweet from a couple weeks ago, July 16th. It turned out to be very, very prescient because what were just rumors at the time actually turned out to be the case. Now we are getting a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill. The legislation was just presented, officially published by Lummis. And then Trump obviously said the exact same thing. And currently he's the narrow front runner in the race as we talk here on August 2nd, 2024. So kind of just walk us through, this tweet and what the actual mechanics behind if the U.S. government wanted to buy and hold Bitcoin as a financial asset, how would it do it?
Yeah, so I put that tweet up before any of the details associated with the legislative proposal from Senator Lummis came out, and it was just kind of, okay, is this a meme? What would this meme look like if it was actually operationalized with executive power? Since I was sort of not trying to draft a particular bill, it was just, okay, if Trump was to announce something like this, regardless of what happens with the Senate or the House, what could he do under executive authorities to establish something like a strategic Bitcoin reserve? And so I was just like, as a thought experiment, looking at, what are the tools and sort of funds available to the president under existing authorities that he could interpret to deploy, to buy Bitcoin. And I asked some, people that are not Bitcoiners, but are more experts in the relevant authorities at the Treasury or the Fed to sort of do such a thing. And it seemed like the most sort of direct route for the president themselves to purchase Bitcoin using existing appropriations, right? Because the Congress, holds the power of the purse, but there are existing funds that the president can deploy, in particular in something called the Exchange Stabilization Fund, the ESF. And so there's existing laws on the books from the 1934 Gold Reserve Act, which gives the Treasury Secretary basically the authority to stabilize the dollar in sort of very general terms by purchasing, using existing funds in the ESF, gold, foreign currencies, or stocks, essentially securities or credits. And so it seems pretty clear. I was asking, folks like, could that be applied to the purchase Bitcoin? And would likely require kind of an interpretation by sort of official legal memo, either Treasury Office of General Counsel, the Office of Legal Counsel of the White House, have enough lawyers basically interpret the Gold Reserve Act by stipulating that either Bitcoin is treated as foreign exchange, and you could point to, say, its use as a currency in El Salvador, or its wide use as a medium of exchange, sort of check that sort of that legal box of fitting that definition. Or if you were being really restrictive to only purchasing explicit securities, it wouldn't necessarily be a true Bitcoin reserve, but you could purchase essentially, like Bitcoin ETF as a security. Now, of course, what has since come out is the Lummis bill, which would formalize such a strategic Bitcoin reserve. I mean, if the president did it, it would just be kind of in name only. It would be subject to future presidents undoing it. So, any sustainability to such a policy would really come down to establishing it in law. And that's something obviously, the first move in that direction was the Bitcoin Reserve Bill put in place or introduced by Senator Lummis.
The Bitcoin Layer is proud to be sponsored by Unchained, the leader in Bitcoin financial services. Unchained empowers you to take full control of your Bitcoin with a collaborative multi-sig vault, where you hold 2 of the 3 keys and benefit from a Bitcoin security partner. Purchase Bitcoin directly into your cold storage vault and eliminate exchange risks with Unchained's trading desk. Unchained also offers the best IRA product in the industry, allowing you to easily roll over your old 401ks or IRAs into Bitcoin while keeping control of your keys. Don't pay more taxes than you have to. Talk to them today. Visit unchained.com/TBL and use code TBL for $100 off when you create an account. And now back to the video. So, these 2 methods of doing it, either underneath the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, categorizing it as foreign exchange or other credits, instruments of credit or security. There was another approach that you talked about, which was the Fed's emergency authorities for unusual and exigent circumstances to set up an SPV, a special purpose vehicle. You said that this was more of a stretch. Can you explain what the Fed's emergency authorities are and how they could be applied to acquire Bitcoin?
Yeah, so that was just being a little bit more speculative. Like, what are the other avenues that
Mhm.
would require new legislation, and the 13.3 authority that gives the Federal Reserve chairman the ability to declare unusual and exigent circumstances, and then to create essentially credit facilities to mitigate those unusual or exigent circumstances. And so this happened in the COVID crisis, where there was exceptional distress in private credit markets, especially corporate credit markets, and the Fed had not historically had any facilities to directly go out and buy commercial paper. And so they set up essentially special purpose vehicles under this authority, and they essentially then lent dollars, newly created dollars, lent those to the special purpose vehicle. Then the special purpose vehicle, SPV, went out into the open market and just bought distressed commercial paper to try to stabilize that market in that crisis environment. And so the Fed has the authority, at least in certain unusual and exigent circumstances, to establish these SPVs, lend them essentially, large amounts of capital, and then they can go out and buy securities or other instruments where necessary. Now, I asked some folks, that are experts at sort of Yale at the Yale Institute for, I think, sort of crisis studies, and they're sort of experts on sort of the Fed's emergency authorities, and they sort of poured cold water on that. Like, that unusual and exigent circumstances designation is quite strict, and also, like, you'd be having to go through a lot of, like, the internal bureaucratic resistance inside the Fed to do such a thing. It was more of a like a pipe dream, and as opposed to like a plausible scenario.
Wonderful. And now we have something of a more plausible scenario. I mean, all the mechanics aren't necessarily laid out in Lummis's bill, but now that we actually have it on hand, it is interesting. I had a chance to have Cynthia Lummis on last week at the time that this one will go live the following Tuesday, rather, after we're recording this. And did you get a chance to take a look at the bill and anything in particular stick out to you? Like, there was a whole section on proof of reserves as well. I got to ask her a little bit about that. The details aren't ironed out, but anything in the bill stick out to you in particular?
Well, I mean, the very fact that there is such a thing as a national strategic Bitcoin reserve being introduced is quite a marked development. I sort of interpret the bill through sort of three different lenses, right?
Mm-hmm.
One is like signaling, right? So this is a clear statement of intent, a sort of a seriousness of purpose by a serious legislator to move a certain policy. This isn't just like just making up words. Like, she has actually the intent to try to get bipartisan commitment, and under a future administration try to get something like this passed. But it's a matter of just establishing such a thing, right, as a strategic Bitcoin reserve for the U.S. government. So that's like one lens is just, okay, the establishment of such a structure as like an important strategic shift in the U.S. government's official approach and disposition towards Bitcoin. The second lens is what's the scale that we're talking about, right? Because you can imagine such a thing existing and it essentially be essentially de minimis, or just having the existing BTC that the government holds from asset seizures essentially just be sort of relocated in that reserve, but not fundamentally sort of changing its long-term scale. And so she's put together a certain vision of kind of the target mark of 1 million Bitcoin, which is certainly ambitious. And then the third lens is its implementation and funding, right? So what exactly is going to be the source of funds given the choice of scale? Right, so I think assessing this policy proposal kind of need to distinguish between the merits of such a reserve being created in the first place, and from the approach that you might take to designate a certain target scale, and then how you might fund it. And that's where the devil's in the details. But so yeah, I thought that it was a pretty serious, well thought out bill in terms of to meet that strategic purpose. And I think it'll go through a number of different iterations as it gets into the policy process, and as other people start to ask questions about it and try to get ideally like bipartisan support for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, from the funding component, this part surprised Nick and I in particular when we parsed through the bill, was that one huge component of how they plan on funding it was taking our gold certificates that are
Hmm.
actually still valued at our 1971 price, which I didn't know. They're not mark to market valued, but valuing them at today's price, flipping it into cash, and then using those proceeds to buy Bitcoin. Um, what do you think of that? That's pretty novel. And as it stands right now, the gold certificates aren't really doing much of anything, especially valued at, their 1971 price. And I'd say that the United States has a strong enough position where, in terms of our reserves, in terms of the entrenchment, if you will, of the U.S. Treasuries as an asset around the globe, like we have a strong enough reserve base that we really don't need these certificates anymore. What do you think about revaluing them at today's prices, selling them for cash, and then buying Bitcoin? Does that seem like a pretty sound strategy? How do you think that would go over in Washington as well?
It's certainly, I think, interesting. I think that was put together to try to make it essentially dollar neutral and budget neutral,
Hmm.
right? Because if you're trying to fund such a thing as strategic Bitcoin reserve of any sizable size, you have to look over, okay, how are we going to fund this, right? And your choices are essentially, do we add it to the existing budget appropriations, in which case what we're really talking about is then creating new debt to buy Bitcoin. And if the nominal purpose, or at least one of the nominal purposes of the bill, essentially, improve the nation's long-term fiscal health, it's maybe not ideal policy objective to sort of create debt to buy Bitcoin. So that sort of excludes, at least that class of options. Other is to sort of cut existing programs, and there's certain folks I think in Congress that would be just fine cutting existing, government spending and buy Bitcoin instead. That's maybe not as politically palatable or make it as politically, desirable to other folks across the aisle to try to get something that's through. So if you don't want to raise debt or if you don't want to cut spending, okay, you're gonna need to be clever. And there's something poetic about essentially taking these kind of legacy, kind of unmarked, unmarked to market gold certificates that have like a notional value of like $11 billion that sort of is the Treasury owes the Fed, and essentially instructing them to remark those to market, and effectively freeing up, at current market prices, roughly $600 billion in liquidity, that would essentially be booked on the Treasury's general account at the Fed, right? So the mechanics of this is kind of an accounting trick to a certain extent, right? But then again, our entire monetary system is basically one big series of accounting tricks between the Fed and the Treasury. So this is just playing that game that we do for almost everything that relates to our monetary structure, where the Fed just can change its liabilities and assets, given existing laws, and this is a sort of an available option. It's almost like the Bitcoiners version of like the platinum coin trick, right? In the sense of, okay, we can essentially leverage existing structures of sort of accounting relationships between the Fed's balance sheet and the Treasury's balance sheet to take what is essentially an inert asset on the government's books, a whole bunch of these gold certificates that we haven't balanced, and deploying them into Bitcoin. Now, I have to say, like, mechanically that's the I don't see anything like legally problematic with that. I think all these things come with scale, right? Like doing this with $5 billion is probably not that big of a deal. Doing it with $600 billion, well, that's like a different thing, right? And the Treasury General Account, as we've seen with the Secretary Yellen's strategic use of sort of drawing it down, can have essentially fiscal and economic effects, right? Especially something that's $500 billion. That could have other effects on the market, not just Bitcoin market, but so I think, I don't know, I would want there to be serious policy analysis of what would be potential second and third order implications, because if you were to monetize that $600 billion worth of gold, you're not going to buy $600 billion worth of Bitcoin immediately. So what else are you going to use that for? What else would you want to use that for? So I think a lot of this comes down to calibrating the scale. And potentially, I'm fundamentally like a pragmatist, and I want to do things in a controlled and deliberate fashion. And so I would always be like, okay, what's a phased implementation of such a thing, right? Start small, test out the market, test out, potential second and third order implications that, are, impossible to predict when you do something that's a little bit novel, and then sort of scale it up over time. I think that's how you would approach any policy change in general is you want to kind of do it in a deliberative fashion. But I think mechanically there's nothing, prima facie, intractable about that proposed approach. I think it just comes down to kind of the scale and the phased implementation of it.
Mm. And so, like putting aside the implementation, the mechanics of doing it, what are some potential second order effects in your mind that obviously you're involved in everything. So like, what kind of second order effects do you think this would have on financial markets, geopolitics, etc.? Like, should this get passed? Should we actually start actively accumulating Bitcoin? What are the second order effects of that on the world stage?
So I think just the fact that you've had leading presidential candidates essentially lay a line in the sand that's explicitly and pretty definitively pro Bitcoin as a national reserve asset. That has to trigger, and I'm sure is triggering, serious discussions inside many different political leadership chains of what exactly is happening. Are they serious? Well, then then they have to explore the what ifs, right? And so I have to imagine there's a whole set of bureaucrats in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, in Beijing, in Moscow, in Brussels, in Singapore, in Hong Kong that are paying close attention to everything that Trump has said and that other politicians are saying about Bitcoin, and asking themselves and asking each other, okay, well, what if the U.S. government did pursue such a plan? What would be our approach? How would we respond? And while it's impossible to predict how all those different actors might decide to react to that policy move, it's you can predict that they will have to react to it in some way, and that is certainly a novel development and a sort of a phase transition in Bitcoin's role on the geopolitical stage. Right, 2 years ago, that wouldn't be, I think, a plausible, realistic question to ask. Now it is, and the fact that it is a real question that serious policymakers in parts of the world have to ask each other, and that national leaders then have to take seriously, means that Bitcoin is now a player at a geopolitical level. And that means it will affect geopolitics and will likely be affected by geopolitics. And that's, those are dynamics that are very hard to predict. I think there's, a certain strain of thought that goes very simply in terms of like a Bitcoin arms race. You must be first. And that this sort of, domino falls and then everyone basically has to scramble. I think reality is a lot messier than that. There's usually frictions. There's usually other levers of power and geopolitical dynamics and personal incentives that, could sort of change how that story might play out. Well, I'm not saying that it wouldn't be a dynamic to be paying attention to, but I don't know if Trump just comes in and says, we're buying Bitcoin, then all of a sudden within 2 months, everyone's buying Bitcoin, right? I think there's lots of other ways that this could play out. That's certainly one of them, but it adds a much more different and important dynamic to how countries have approached Bitcoin. And that would be a pretty significant development. Just on the mechanics of Bitcoin in the global system, right? Like there is, I think a sense that the security architecture of the world, the economic architecture, the monetary architecture are coming under increased strain. Countries are trying to look out for their own interests, and the ability of the U.S. government to serve as sort of a hegemonic security guarantor to sort of reinforce a security zone in which essentially the dollar reigns supreme, that is coming under severe pressure. It just is. Like the fact that the United States can't effectively secure free trade in the Middle East is a major issue. The fact that apparently we're explicitly trying to pressure Netanyahu in public not to escalate with Iran, and we'll see if they actually listen to the U.S. government. Shows that essentially the U.S.'s chips in terms of determining with a certain degree of hegemonic force, other different actors in the system, their security decisions is changing, and so you're seeing a rise of sort of middle powers that are looking to play East and West off each other, and that want to hedge their bets, right? Want to hedge their risk in terms of their exposure to the Treasury system. And the Treasury Reserve asset, which functions essentially as the global reserve asset in the global economic system, has, I would call it like sort of, and this is being a bit wonky, sort of a metastable structure. So like metastable, if you think about like a curve, right? It's got a certain dip to it. And so within a certain range, it essentially has feedback loops, right? Like traditional recessions, right? Treasury securities are the safe reserve asset. There's a flight to safety. So within a certain regime, treasuries are seen as extremely desirable, scarce assets under certain sort of crisis conditions, traditional kind of financial crises or recessions. You see yields come down. You see people wanting to sort of reduce their exposure to risk assets. So that's been sort of a good function of the Treasury Reserve asset in the global system. It also functions essentially as good collateral, especially on the short end. It usually functions as sort of money-like collateral, like a 3-month T-bill is very close to essentially a dollar deposit. And as the world wants to have more money-like instruments, that serves a valuable collateral function. And so there are I think an increasing amount of dynamics though that are playing out both geopolitically as well as monetarily that could push the treasury market above that hump, right? Where it no longer is in a regime where it's sort of self-stabilizing, but where it leads to a regime that's a much more unstable crisis. And that's what essentially, if you look at some of the behind-the-scenes policy maneuvers the U.S. government has been engaged in over the last few years since COVID, has been trying to prepare and sort of patch together a mix of instruments and facilities to try to forestall that type of runaway feedback loop from kicking into place. And these are a bit technocratic, but things like the standing repo facility, the FIMA repo facility, central clearing of U.S. Treasury securities that's being mandated, the required registration of higher frequency sort of hedge fund traders that trade Treasury securities. They're called proprietary trading funds, have to register as dealers. So all of these are mechanisms for the U.S. government to basically try to put their arms around the Treasury market to try to contain its instability and to try to put in place essentially fire breaks in advance of a potential crisis, and to then sort of create structural drivers of demand for our debt, which we know we're basically on a runaway course to keep producing more of, right? The stock of debt is itself very large, and so there's a limited amount of balance sheet capacity, in the world to absorb it, and that has forced us to sort of shift our issuance to the short end as a result, because there's not many natural buyers for 10, 20, 30-year paper. So anyways, that was a bit of a rant of like Bitcoin, essentially, its aspirations, it's certainly a speculative reserve asset, but its aspirations along the sort of path of monetization and its increasingly serious role as a geopolitical, topic, is coming into play a potential alternative as a neutral reserve asset, which from the U.S. government's perspective could be good or bad depending on what our position in Bitcoin is, right? If China and Russia and Iran get the first move on Bitcoin and we kick it out and it monetizes alongside gold, well then we would be in trouble. But if it turns out we get smart and we decide that we want to put in place a reserve strategy that augments our own national balance sheet and monetizes Bitcoin relative to gold in that sort of disruptive scenario, then we would stand to gain disproportionately relative to our adversaries. So, these are contingent historical decisions. Bitcoin is playing a different game right now.
It absolutely is. I mean, on its path to monetization, Bitcoin's properties, at TBL, our whole thesis is that Bitcoin's properties allow it to be this neutral reserve asset for the world. But people trade it like the NASDAQ. And so if the U.S. catches on before other superpowers, then that would be excellent for us. If they catch on before us, very bad, and are already kind of tenuous, I wouldn't say tenuous, situation in the world, I suppose, wherein you have these nations kind of coalescing around the idea of putting hard money at the center of their reserve policy. We could do the same thing, except without, kind of instead of using gold for that, we could use Bitcoin. So tremendous stuff. Are there, any other sort of, actually, I'll have our editor cut that piece out. I'll move into AI if that's okay.
Let's do it.
Phenomenal. Love it. Because you hit on everything. I was just about to ask like any other, because I had a question written down about, national strategic interests over Bitcoin, but you crushed it. So, let's shift gears to AI here. I want to talk to you about it. Obviously, this, the development of artificial intelligence over the last 24 months, especially, has really begun accelerating very rapid. So along with these developments, AI, other technologies along with it, what are some of the key security challenges that you foresee, right? Obviously, you're deeply involved in security, you're deeply involved in policy. What are some of the key security challenges you foresee around AI and its development, and how can governments and other private entities prepare to address these risks?
Yes, and while sort of the tech hype cycle waxes and wanes, I think there is a clear consensus in the national security and policy community that that these emerging disruptive technologies are on their way. And so AI, but generative AI, but also broader applications of AI in weapon systems and in surveillance and in increasingly more sort of automated sorts of sort of decision, like support applications, will become increasingly a strategic national security and economic security technology. And we're sort of trying to get our arms around the rate of change and the scope and scale of the social, economic, and strategic impacts. The U.S. government, historically has viewed disruptive technologies as coming fundamentally from like out of its own ecosystem of sort of incubation. If you look in the sort of the post, both obviously the canonical example is Manhattan Project. We took all the smartest people in our country and other countries. We said this is a strategic program. Everyone got involved. That was just one program under essentially a state-directed scientific and technological sort of research and development project, managed by Vannevar Bush, during and after World War II, where the U.S. government put in place sort of an architecture, an umbrella around academia, industry, and government research to kind of push the frontier of technological development. And so in that sort of domain, in that sort of environment, the U.S. government was rarely surprised by new technological development. Usually it was the one that knew things before everybody else, and it was making those decisions about which parts of the tech tree to explore, which ones to keep secret, which ones to commercialize. I think what has happened in the past few years is that dynamic has been changing for a while, but sort of it was a gradually then suddenly sort of moment where all of a sudden the legacy sort of bureaucratic systems all of a sudden realized that there were these emerging disruptive technologies that were being catalyzed and now rapidly developing outside of that traditional control structure, right? And I think what you're seeing is sort of this attempt to try to catch up and kind of put in place at least patchwork mechanisms of sort of public-private partnerships to understand and then to kind of maybe pump the brakes on some of what they view as like fundamentally dual-use technologies, right? And dual-use technologies sort of as a term of art has been used for a while to refer to like technologies that have both traditional, normal, private commercial applications as well as strategic military applications. And so there's been an architecture of arms control, export control, international regulations that have been driven by the West. Canonical example is the Wassenaar Treaty for essentially limiting sort of nuclear proliferation. There's talk about essentially how or if we can apply that similar type of framework towards what are essentially now fundamental computing technologies, right? The full sort of supply chain from leading edge semiconductor fabrication capabilities, as well as like the input tooling, right? The ASML kind of EUV machines, all the way to the actual final product in terms of like these advanced processor chips, GPUs, et cetera, as well as export controls and sort of KYC for the cloud infrastructure that AI is going to be deployed on. And so that is a much more difficult and fraught territory for the U.S. government, kind of traditional security policy approach to operate in, because it's not just kind of like nuclear proliferation and sort of nuclear, reactors are kind of a legacy. It's kind of a small niche business for, very large companies, and, it's appropriately regulated under government auspices. Deploying AI consumer applications by frontier labs that are also conducting research that the U.S. government potentially views as being strategically disruptive sort of puts them in a very uncomfortable position. They haven't, had to kind of where to find that balance, and I think you're seeing kind of these, this kind of catch up and kind of a build it on the fly approach, and it's overlaid with the fact that there's intense geopolitical competition for these technologies and for the know-how that goes into it, and to kind of hold at risk or exploit the supply chains that that sort of determine national advantage. And so the U.S. has made pretty explicit policy objective that we will contain China's technological ambitions. That we view it essentially as a matter of national security that China not develop too quickly economically and technologically. That we want to maintain as large a lead as possible. The sort of colloquial definition that's been given is like we want to have a small yard, high fence. But if you look at sort of the policy sort of evolution since that sort of framework was put in place about 2 years ago, is that the fence has started to get bigger, like the area of coverage has gotten bigger, and the fences have sort of gotten taller. And so you're setting up this sort of potential collision course between U.S. and China, and also U.S. and our allies, where it seems like we're coming up against the point of sort of friction with the ability where we can impose costs on our allies without getting much security bang for the buck, right? So we're trying to enforce these export controls, say on the South Korean national champions, the Dutch national champions, the Japanese national champions, really forcing them to essentially don't sell your equipment to the Chinese and eat the market loss, right? And at a certain point, you want to be good friends of America, and America certainly is important for your own security protection and your own economic relationships. But there is a point at which that pain is too much. And so we're finding out in real time, and the U.S. government's finding out in real time, how can we essentially create kind of a tech containment strategy around China, and what are the economic and diplomatic costs of that strategy? Where are the limits? And AI certainly is probably at the frontier. The U.S. government, though, thinks about, so that's like on the supply chain side in terms of how to think about the geopolitics of AI from sort of the basic substrate, right? Like from everything from the initial tooling, fabrication, the chips, the cloud hyperscalers, and then the frontier model labs that are then deploying the leading capabilities, and then the Microsoft, et cetera, kind of setting up sort of hosting for inference around the world, and sort of an intense competition to sort of dominate that value chain and that emerging market. But from a pure security concern, the U.S. government is looking at these models becoming increasingly capable of essentially, performing cognitively demanding tasks, and then chaining together sequences of tasks to perform, similar sorts of economic and potential, malign behaviors as humans do, right? And so the two domains of say acute concern for the national security folks is in cyber and in bio. So in bio, there's a active assessment going on for every leading model that's getting developed, is to say how much does this sort of augment the ability of a smart but not specialist trained person from creating essentially a bioweapon, right? Like, can it? We're not there yet, but like that's a marker that they've put essentially, and they're trying to develop essentially red team assessments and evaluations that would give the labs and the governments confidence that these increasingly general purpose models don't provide that type of kind of asymmetric augmentation to produce exceptionally destructive sort of weapons or support terrorist activities. That's one concern. The other is in cybersecurity. So that's my professional field. And there's been a lot of hype about LLMs being used to identify vulnerabilities in software, and that's mostly hype for now. Really, I think anyone's really been able to demonstrate with existing models that they're really getting to state of the art or advancing in terms of the ability to identify and develop sort of novel exploits, sort of 0 days. But they are good at essentially helping do other sorts of general code, right? And they're also really good at translating to English. And so there's lots of low-hanging activities in cybersecurity for offensive purposes that you can definitely sort of augment and scale. So one person can do maybe the job of what 2 or 3 people used to do, because you can automate some of these more mundane sorts of tasks when you're sort of have already established persistence in a target network, or in particular you're really on the low end and you just don't speak English very well, and you want to have a convincing lure for social engineering or spear phishing. well, these are really good to kind of help you jump that hurdle, right? Now you don't need to be a fluent English speaker to spearfish someone in English, right? That's already done for you. So, that's some more nuisance though. These aren't like the existential threats of like an AI system developing or really exceeding the capabilities of current offensive hacking teams. But that is certainly an active area of exploration by, everybody, is to see, what could be coming down the pike, because that's maybe like a nonlinear capability jump. And so that's all kind of in the more mundane sphere of AI. I think stepping back, there's a big sort of social, almost cultural fight underway, and this is where maybe AI connects to Bitcoin as well. Is given the rate of change and disruption that could potentially be coming down the pike from these sorts of technological developments, existing systems of power, bureaucracy, regulation, law, and sort of legitimacy are feeling a bit anxious, I would say, right? It's like the vibe is like, anxious, and that the foundation is a bit shaky. And so to the extent, like the natural reaction of any human in those systems is to try to like slow things down, contain them, and like prevent sort of that curve from like jumping too fast, right? And I think that's sort of, it comes out in all these different areas of, just trying to like keep the status quo, basically, right? The status quo works for the people that are in power, right? Generally speaking, that's been true throughout history. When you're already on top, when you run the show, when you're already rich, when, things are good, you don't like disruption, right? You're asymmetrically exposed to disruption, right? So you're then incentivized to mitigate disruptions, to, stop disruptions. Even if they could be, creative and beneficial to other segments of society. They fundamentally involve like a redistribution of power, wealth, influence, status, etc. So I think that's like behind a lot of this fight that you see in AI between kind of the certain cohort of folks looking to kind of either de facto nationalize AI, sort of, especially frontier sort of labs, or at least to put like a national box around them, or to create essentially a protected sandbox for like the true frontier labs, and kind of give them essentially special perks and special protections, but also special oversight, and kind of like a moat around them versus open source. And this sort of fight sort of between the political economy of these disruptive technologies, like who will gain, who will lose, how the distribution of these of the potential gains be allocated across society in a country and around the world. And those are always very difficult, fraught questions, like in any society, right? Like you have a surplus from growth. How do you apportion that surplus? Does it go, this has been the age-old debate, right? Pure capitalism, pure socialism, or somewhere in between. Those debates get accentuated and amplified when the prospect of those surpluses, one, increases in scale and seems to be coming very, very, very soon. So if you actually believe that AI will unlock the productivity boom, it'll be this massive disruptive capability that, if you can monetize it, if you're in a position to essentially monetize it, essentially as like a neo-digital feudal lord, and you can essentially obsolete large portions of white-collar labor, there's an immense amount of economic surplus/rent that you could be in a position to extract from the rest of society. And now governments have an interest, one, to like ensure that they don't get, there isn't that sort of exploitative, oligarchy that sort of sits on top of society. But also, they have an interest in ensuring that they don't get displaced, right, in terms of their position of power. But the individual citizen also has an interest in ensuring that they aren't subject to the whims of either an arbitrary tech oligarch or an arbitrary, political sort of autocrat. And I think this is where there's sort of a natural alignment between the ethos of Bitcoin, the ethos of open source software, and kind of the idea that as much as you can, create decentralizing pressures that empower the individual, as opposed to these concentrated sources of capital and technological capability, that is the real dynamic and sort of power competition that would play out. So anyways, that was a bit of a ramble rant, but that's how I think about all that stuff.
Fantastic. No, it was very good. It was very good. And, for the people who are watching, if you haven't already followed Matt Pines, go toss him a follow. We'll give you guys the ad. You can check it out in the description, or if you're watching this on Twitter. But remarkable. And so if you want to see him talk about this stuff in real time, fascinating developments. Particularly with everything that's happening with the U.S. and Taiwan, tensions rising. Um, what do you think about and we'll keep this kind of, I guess this part kind of brief because I definitely do want to ask you about UFOs and what's going on with all of that. But the election's coming up. Obviously, we have a brand new candidate. Tensions rising in Taiwan, obviously huge, for semiconductors. TSMC kind of at the center of all of this. What do you think about moving into the election? What candidate would be better for our relationship with Taiwan, and what kind of relationship do we want to have with them moving forward? I know we're building facilities here in the United States, but still, when it comes to semiconductors, Taiwan is still the powerhouse. And so, where's your head at as we head into November, given that Taiwan is such an important player when it comes to AI because of its role in semiconductors?
Yeah, so there's a lot packed into that question. One is like the importance of Taiwan geopolitically is only amplified by the importance of TSMC. I think even without TSMC and before TSMC existed really as a critical part of the AI supply chain, Taiwan was a fulcrum in our U.S. China relationship, and it will continue to play that role. And that's for almost just like pure geographic reasons. Like it's kind of this cork in the bottle that hems in China's naval and power production aspirations past the first island chain. And so just the pure kind of geography in that part of the world means that Taiwan is critical to kind of this unfolding competition between the U.S. and China, right? Sort of a status quo power that dominates the existing monetary and security system, especially has enforced kind of an architecture, security and economic architecture in Asia that China is sort of brushing up against and wants to fundamentally change, right? So China's objectives is to essentially push the U.S. as a dominant power out of its neighborhood, right? That is its strategic objective, and then to essentially establish itself as a global power, as a peer to the United States across every domain. And so it is not a rule giver. It's not a rule taker. It's a rule giver, and that it can shape its near abroad. It can have its own essentially regional and global spheres of influence. And Taiwan is fundamentally like a major hurdle in that larger geopolitical objective. As far as the politics of it, I really don't know. I mean, I haven't really seen a definitive statement from Harris or Harris's campaign on what her position is there. I think she's defaulted to the existing Biden view because she's a member of the current administration. She can't really change the policy track. But even Trump's, I think, views on Taiwan are a bit mixed. So it's hard to predict what he would do under different conditions. I mean, fundamentally, right, from a certain angle, he might just make a deal, sell the Taiwanese out if China gives him a better deal. But I also think that he could be convinced, and he's got folks that are, certainly influential in his ear that are extremely like China hawks, and that he certainly is in no mood to give China any favors, and potentially would up the currency and economic and trade war with China, and that could lead not to a deal but to an increase in tensions over Taiwan. So I could see scenarios just like, for example, with North Korea, where, you saw, scenarios where we came very close to war with North Korea under Trump. And we also saw a scenario under Trump where Trump visited North Korea and shook hands with Kim Jong-un and walked across the DMZ. Mm-hmm. So if you asked me, before Trump took office, right, which scenario would we get under Trump? Would we like almost go to war with North Korea, or would we like become almost like best friends and write love letters to each other? And if you said both, right, you would have been like, well, that's incoherent. That's an insane, picture of the future. There's no way those both things would happen, right? And both things did happen. So that leads me to believe a Trump administration under China, a China policy under Trump would be, probably a bit of a Schrodinger's cat, right? It would be extremely hawkish and probably willing to sort of flirt with war, or up to that limit in order to maximize bargaining power, but would also be potentially open to making pretty dramatic, grand bargains at the same time. So I'd say that's my like naive assessment. But I think American politics at this point and our geopolitical strategy are fundamentally almost orthogonal, right? Like foreign policy decisions are heavily politicized. They're not really driven by a long-term strategy. They're driven by, electoral coalitions and the news cycle. which is unfortunate. So it means that usually we're much more reactive than proactive, and it makes predicting 4 years of an administration's foreign policy almost impossible because I think those conditions will only accelerate.
Hmm.
So yeah, so not necessarily optimistic either way in terms of the ability to forecast those dynamics. But yeah, China is. Last thing I'll say on China is, President Xi has um, been embarking on a multi-year project of essentially, reinforcing his economy as like fortress China. And so they've put in place something called like a dual circulation strategy. They announced like a trillion RMB strategic investment program to build up domestic stockpiles of grains and energy, but also to improve their economic and security resilience. It's become like a top priority of the National Development and Reform Commission. That's now filtering through the bureaucracies as like one of the top level kind of strategic plans that is being implemented across the country, and it is explicitly to prepare for what they call like extreme conditions, right? Which in their argot is basically war, right? They're looking at the Ukraine Russia situation. They're looking at obviously the post-COVID environment and increasing geopolitical tensions, and Xi for many years, but it's sort of accelerated recently, is looking essentially, he prioritized security, prioritize economic security, national security, his strategic resilience, and that can be kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. You could say he's just trying to demonstrate increased resilience so that he doesn't get deterred, and also makes us less likely to engage in conflict and feel like they're in a stronger position. But he feels like he needs to, make absorb substantial economic costs in order to prioritize security. And it could be because he's planning for war.
Hmm.
Maybe that's not extremely, high confidence, but he's moving his country in a direction to make them more resilient and more prepared for acute conflict scenarios, which is, maybe not the most promising direction.
Not promising. I know I certainly don't want to get drafted to World War III. Hopefully, by the time it does come around, God forbid it does, I will be above the age of the draft. We'll see. So now for the most fun part. This interview has been absolutely excellent so far. I really do thank you for coming on. Extraterrestrial technology. So lately, I mean, you've been talking a lot about this, right? Unidentified anomalous phenomena, right? So a lot of talk about that. A lot of talk about the U.S. government potentially disclosing info about that. What are your thoughts on kind of the credibility of these claims that UFOs are real? What are your thoughts on whistleblowers? I suppose. And do you think that people who do know about these things aren't coming out of the woodwork as much as they would be because there aren't sufficient protections in place? Obviously, a very broad question, but generally, I guess, what do you think about UAPs? What do you think about telling the public about them? What do you think that would do to public trust, national security? Kind of your entire thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, so this is the fourth of these like four big disruptions that at least I think about a lot for this decade. Some are inside the Overton window and definitely at the center of sort of accepted policy discourse. China obviously for a while. AI increasingly now has moved into the center of that discourse. Used to be pretty fringe to think about AGI and superintelligence and AI catastrophes. That was sort of that was the discourse in fringe blogs and sort of weird effective altruist communities on Less Wrong or folks that were kind of obsessed with a very kind of niche, somewhat taboo topic. And then pretty quickly, as a result of material changes, it moved, and now you had serious people now aggressively looking at the implications for geopolitics, economy, society at large. Bitcoin, you could argue, is like not quite further along in that Overton, evolution, but it is pretty far along. A few years ago, to think about Bitcoin as a geopolitically relevant asset class would have been, a notional hypothetical, and now it's pretty obvious it is, right? The former president of the United States is talking about it. Almost by definition, it is. But it's not, hasn't, I think, evolved to the same level that AI in China has in terms of these big policy questions of potential disruptions. UAPs, are also, I would say, further along, outside that Overton window, but have been creeping in to the center, maybe without the notice of most casual observers. But it is an increasingly and very serious topic of policy debate and discourse inside the U.S. government, inside the Senate. They don't make that very public. They try not to make it very public, but it is extremely serious. And they are debating exactly how far to go, how fast. And it goes to this very question, right, which is sort of the existential question, of humanity, which is, what is the nature of our species? How, are we alone in the universe? And what explains these phenomena, which the U.S. government has admitted are real, unidentified anomalous phenomenon refers to, discrete things that they have detected on sensor platforms, etc. The question is, what are those phenomena, right? What accounts for them? And the implication of testimony by David Grush, by Carl Nell, by others behind closed doors to inspectors generals, but also, importantly, to intelligence committees on the Hill, specifically the Senate and House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, is that we have been studying these phenomenon for many decades. In fact, we have in possession technologies of unknown origin in biological materials. Those turns of phrase are explicitly defined by Senate legislation that was introduced last year called the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomenon Disclosure Act. Kind of says it, right? And they passed it. The Senate passed that bill, 64 pages of bill. I can't, read the whole bill to you, everyone on this listening to this podcast, but I would encourage everyone, if you want to just acquaint yourself with what your legislators are putting in law, what definitions that they're writing when they have to define non-human intelligence, which they use in that bill 14 times, when they define technologies of unknown origin, when they stipulate legacy programs to retrieve and exploit technologies of unknown origin associated with UAP. These should be this is like the equivalent of the U.S. government writing serious legislation to, find Bigfoot, right? And to see if
they're articulating that there is something. They're ascribing names and identifiers to these things. So that's a tacit, explicit recognition that they are real.
Yes. They are the premise of the program. The premise of the bill is that these programs exist, these materials exist, and the function of the bill is to establish a more transparent, formal, and accountable process to bring certain elements of those legacy programs, they call them legacy programs, out to the public. And this is the most difficult part of this whole thing, is because those legacy programs, have been historically, as you would imagine, most associated with our most advanced research and development platforms for military and intelligence, right? If you've got some whiz-bang thing that you don't really understand and might give you a strategic advantage if you could understand it, well, then you would compartment that, in the most tightly, in the most tight way possible. And you would try to get as many smart scientists and engineers that you can keep a secret into those programs to develop weapons and ISR platforms. And so now, if the U.S. government is parts of the U.S. government are looking to selectively disclose aspects of these programs to the American public and to the world, well, there's a difficult question of how do you do that in a way that doesn't affect U.S. national security? If these, two questions, meaning the question of, is there such a thing as non-human intelligence responsible for these advanced technologies of unknown origin and these alleged biological materials? That fact of is not government information, right? The existence of the moon, the existence of, other intelligence is not government information the government can classify. A government weapon system or a government surveillance reconnaissance platform certainly is government information. Certainly not something I would want the government to just, leak and destroy an advantage that we have over increasingly aggressive adversaries. So I am for, a deliberate, controlled disclosure that would make the fact of known while protecting, the sources and methods and special platforms that the U.S. government might have. I'm not saying we do have them, but that, that would be a consideration. So we are, heading into this, this is not going to be like an overnight thing. This will be a process that's unfolding as increasingly serious people that have knowledge of these programs come out and try to sort of move this along in a deliberate fashion. It's heavily politically contested. As you can imagine, if there were these decades of legacy programs and, defense contractors, et cetera, that have been husbanding this material on behalf of the U.S. government, they would have, strong interest in maybe getting liability for themselves for any past misdeeds that they may have performed, including, violations of federal acquisition sort of regulations, sort of traditional white-collar crime, or maybe more morally abhorrent actions necessary in their minds to protect the secrecy of these programs. So there's a debate, I think, happening between the people that control these programs and the people that want to disclose aspects of this information. How far? What sorts of deals essentially have to get done? What sorts of conditions get made? The solution that the Senate came to sort of resolve this is, because the Senate doesn't want to have to own that hot potato, is to create a separate independent review board. And that's what they would create with this UAPDA. Essentially says, we've had credible testimony and evidence that tells us that these programs exist, that they have not been reported to Congress in an accountable and legal fashion, that there have been misuse of, like, for example, Atomic Energy Act sort of secrecy provisions, and that in the interest of mitigating the possibility of technological surprise from, say, foreign adversaries, in the interest of open research and development based off of science and technology insights from these programs, and in sort of the furtherance of the public interest, that we should have a independent panel, and they specify 9 members to join this commission that would have full powers of subpoena, unilateral declassification with only presidential override, to basically inventory all the UAP records and materials in the U.S. government's possession, but also in the hands of private entities, including, say, private aerospace companies, and make a recommendation to the president to selectively disclose those records and those materials to the American public in a specified fashion. And so that is what the bill would do. That specific review board provision was stripped out in conference committee last December as a result of contention with the House of Representatives on the FY24 National Defense Authorization Act. It has been reintroduced in full by its sponsors, Senator Rounds and Senator Schumer, who are serious people, right? Senator Schumer is the majority leader in the Senate, Democrat. Senator Rounds is the ranking member on the Senate Armed Services Committee, a Republican. The original UAPDA introduced last year was co-sponsored by, also bipartisan fashion, Senator Gillibrand, New York, Martin Heinrich, Todd Young, Rubio from the Intelligence Committee. These are like serious people. They either have been the subject of a massive deception operation by dozens of people from the intelligence community, sufficient to convince them that these programs are real, to make them go forward with this 64-page bill, or they actually think that these programs exist, and this is an uncomfortable truth that will have to be the Band-Aid will have to be ripped at some point, and sooner rather than later. So this is gonna it's a political process like any other thing, and this is an election year, so we'll see what moves us across the line. But I think all the folks that have been pushing this behind the scenes are trying to, get some momentum behind the UAPDA this year. We'll see. I mean, so far the House doesn't show any interest in moving in the same direction. It just so happens that the chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the chair of the House Armed Services Committee just represent the two districts that are basically sort of locus points of the defense industrial sort of contractor base for allegedly these legacy programs. So in Huntsville, Alabama, and in Ohio, near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Maybe that explains it. I don't know. But it is a political dynamic at this point. The Senate. Senator Schumer, Senator Rounds went to the Senate floor soon after that their bill basically got gutted, and they were like visibly mad. I mean, it was kind of very shocking to me to see senior senators essentially do a scripted colloquy on the Senate floor where they had prepared between their staffs an 8-minute back and forth, basically saying we're not happy that our full bill wasn't passed, and we're going to work together to ensure we get accountability and disclosure of the federal government's knowledge of UAPs. This is what they said, right? I mean, it sounds crazy. You just listen to the senators say this on the Senate floor and then look at the legislative text that they want to push. And it's pretty definitive, right? It doesn't actually show you the craft. And I think the objective is not to show you the craft. The objective is to sort of do this slow, controlled disclosure so you don't get, societal disruptions. And yeah, this is... I don't have a crystal ball, man, but this is one of those things you just gotta like reckon with reality. Reality might be weirder than, you know, you've been led to believe.
Hmm.
So we'll see. But yeah, I don't know. But this is all just procedural. This is all just the politics, the legislation, kind of the mechanics that's underway. Obviously, there's a whole hornet's nest of then implications. Okay, you say these are real things. You say there are actual technologies of unknown origin, advanced metamaterials, biological materials. What does that mean? Bodies? What do you mean, bro?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What do you mean? Like, where do they come from? What are they doing here? What are their plans and intentions? And
Mark
I don't
Zuckerberg.
think. Yeah, sorry, what?
No, I said Mark Zuckerberg.
Well, yeah, we'll see. He seems a bit robotic. Yeah, maybe he's got. But yeah, we're gonna have to maybe face some, questions that might not have easy answers, right? Like, just reconciling with the basic facts will probably be good, a good place to start, and then pursuing those questions with an open scientific and professional discipline, right? I think one of the problems is that because this has been layered in historical social taboo and fictional tropes, and because there hasn't really been in the public serious academic and professional analysis, that even professionals don't really have the conceptual frameworks or vocabularies or the norms to approach these questions seriously, right? And so that's like the first thing that needs to change. There's some groups like the Soul Foundation, started by a Stanford professor, that is looking to kind of change that, and they've got kind of programs to bring academics, serious professionals in to think through these questions in a more open and collaborative and scientific manner. So it isn't just like, well, let's look at our inventory of Hollywood narratives that have been implanted in our minds to sort of come to a naive conclusion on what this represents. Let's look at data. Let's assess facts that we can bring out into the public domain, and let's apply the full capabilities of our scientific and academic brain trust to navigate that terrain. That seems to be the only way you could go forward with this. So we'll see. It's going to be a slow process. I think I would expect there's there's going to be some, I think, more things coming out from folks that have strong reputations, to try to push this along. So we'll see, man. Yeah, as if 2024 couldn't get any weirder.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot to unpack. I mean, I know the only person that I'll be following for all this information will be you, right? So I do appreciate all your work there. You're all over the place, man. You do so much great work, spanning so many different industries and facets of the world we live in today. So I must commend you on having your wits about it all, and then also being unbelievably knowledgeable about all of it. I mean, maybe you are an extraterrestrial life form.
Maybe we all are.
Maybe we all are. Fantastic. Well, Matt, thanks so much for coming on the show. I mean, we'll have to do it again. It's always a pleasure to sit down with you. Thanks for sitting down with me at the Policy Institute as well. That was a great rip, and we'll have to do it again soon because, like you said, 2024 heating up. So we'd love to have you back on. Matt Pines, before we head off, any closing thoughts or anywhere you want to send people?
No, just pay attention.
Pay attention. That's right. All right. Well, he's modest. Go toss him a follow on Twitter at Matthew_Pines, or X rather, at Matthew_Pines. We'll put that up on the screen now, and you can click the that's in the episode link in the description or on this video if you're watching it on X. Matt Pines, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me.